Spider-Man is a superhero action game that was developed by Treyarch, published by Activision, and released on the PS2, Xbox and Gamecube in May of 2002. Reviews were largely good. The game went on to sell over 2 million copies, and at the time it was considered to be the best game based on Spider-Man yet. Loosely based on the plot of the Sam Raimi movie that was released in the same year, this game follows Peter Parker during his early days as a superhero, coming into his own and dealing with his new responsibilities. It's a bit strange of a story, to be honest, especially if you're a fan of the movie, as there are many characters, villains and conflicts within the game that are not in the movie at all. Now, even though there is plenty of extra stuff thrown in to pad this game out, it does end up in a sort of similar place as the film, but it just gets there in a completely different way at times. The narrative almost plays out as if the game went into development before the movie's script was finalised, and they only had a few key scenes locked in they could build a game around. If you're looking for a faithful retelling of this movie, then you're in the wrong place. However, if you're looking for a compelling story based on the web slinger, well, you're still in the wrong place, but the developers found a way to work 4 villains into this game instead of 1, which is better, I guess. Anyway, let's move on to the action. Now, although almost every Spider-Man game that was released after 2004 has an open world New York to explore filled with collectibles and side missions, this game is much more linear. The game is broken up into missions in which you can't freely swing around the city, but instead you're contained to smaller areas of New York, taking on dozens of henchmen and supervillains. What surprised me the most when I revisited this game for the first time in 16 years was just how much of it takes place inside buildings. Apart from the tutorial and the opening mission, I spent a good chunk of the first 5 missions in an old warehouse, a subway, sewers and a clock tower. What's hard about reviewing a game like this is because it is based on a movie, it was most likely developed under a strict timeline. Crafting a large and dense open world may not have been possible with the time afforded to the developers, but you can't help but feel that confining such an acrobatic character to indoors is a bit of a misstep. When you do get a chance to stretch your legs outside, the swinging is decent. It's all fairly straightforward really, as you're able to attach your web to thin air most of the time, and it's pretty easy to manoeuvre Parker around the Big Apple. The only issue with the swinging really is that this is literally the very last Spider-Man game before they figured out how to make Spider-Man games. Most of us are familiar with how the sequel to this title, Spider-Man 2, went on to revolutionise the mechanics of these games, and something that you still see shades of in Spider-Man games today. So while you can't criticise the game for this reason, it does present a small learning curve as you relearn how things used to work. When you're not getting the full use out of Parker's web abilities, you're most likely on the ground or inside throwing all sorts of punches, kicks and a few special moves. The combat is fine. Sort of what you'd expect from an action game of this period. You enter a room, bad guys all charge towards you, and you hammer on the attack button and hope you survive. There are quite a few new combos to unlock, however, learning and executing these combos doesn't make you any less vulnerable, so they're more for style than anything else. You can also use Peter's new powers to pull off some special moves, like creating a web dome or web gloves, techniques I've never seen used in the movies, but hey, why not? The majority of the game is tracking down supervillains and spending a lot of time taking down their henchmen while chasing them through a level until you finally get the chance to confront them. You'll occasionally be tasked with protecting civilians, racing against the clock, or some incredibly light puzzle solving, which does make the experience a little more varied, but due to the non-existent checkpoint system, these tasks feel more like a chore than an exciting diversion. My biggest gripe from a gameplay perspective is the camera. You do have control of your view with the right analog stick, but when running around indoors and even when swinging around outdoors, the camera sure does like to position itself in some awkward places, meaning while you're trying to attack enemies, you're also correcting your view, and this definitely lessens the experience. There is a lock-on mechanic which helps you in more hectic scenarios. This does come in handy in boss battles, but when you're surrounded by 8 thugs, it's best to just leave it alone. Speaking of boss battles, I do have to say that they feel somewhat underwhelming. Once again, I'm aware that this game was probably rushed into stores to line up with the movie, but most boss fights feel like you're just fighting a regular enemy, except with a lot more health. A bonus for this title is that even though the story loosely follows the script, the actors from the movie lend their voices to the game, most notably Tobey Maguire and Willem Dafoe. This does give the game some authenticity, however it certainly does feel like they recorded all of their voice work in one take. The performances they deliver are not even close to the ones seen in the movie, but the level of cheesiness honestly just makes it all the more enjoyable in my opinion.
Morning, you psycho!
I could have stopped you at the fight promoter's office. I could have saved Uncle Ben.
As far as the rest of the game's presentation goes, it actually looks good for a game that is 16 years old and that was probably made in less than 18 months. Spider-Man has some nice detail to his costume, the animation looks decent, and as you'd expect, henchmen are pretty cut and paste, but villains are represented actually quite well, even if some of them look like they're ripped straight from the 90s animated series, which is kind of confusing. You can't roam around New York City, but it does have a nice draw distance, and buildings don't look blurry from far away. Indoor environments show a few flat textures, but actually pack more detail and destructible items than you'd expect from a movie tie-in. Revisiting this game so many years later was very interesting for me. The movie trilogy and the tie-in games were a defining era of my younger days, and it's easy for me to slip into a nostalgic mindset and call this game great. This game hasn't aged the best, which doesn't mean that it's not a fun experience, but it does mean that you'll get the most out of it as a fan of the character and the movies. With the huge library of Spider-Man games out there now, replaying this one may seem a little basic, and the lack of swinging through New York may seem like a misstep. However, Spider-Man is still a good game, especially if you're looking for something fun for a weekend.